The fluorescent lights in my director's office had been flickering for 3 days, and nobody had fixed them because that kind of thing used to fall under my watch. I noticed the irony as my director slid my promotion packet back across the conference table like it was something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. 12 years. 12 years of arriving before sunrise and leaving after the cleaning crew, and he couldn't even be bothered to read past the first page. "I appreciate the effort here, Marcus," he said, leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to earn anything the hard way. "But after reviewing your profile, I just don't think you're the right fit for the senior director role. We need someone with more forward-facing leadership presence. Someone who can speak the language of transformation. Transformation." He'd been at Meridian Financial for 11 months. I'd been there since before he graduated from whatever business school had handed him that diploma on the wall behind him. "I understand," I said. "Thanks for the feedback." He was already glancing at his phone. "Make sure the quarterly systems audit lands on my desk by Friday." I walked out of that conference room the same way the Air Force taught me to leave a room after bad news: straight back, controlled breathing, face like a locked door. 22 years of service teaches you that falling apart in front of the wrong people is a luxury you can't afford. I'd survived 2 deployments, a divorce that nearly broke me, and my mother's stroke. I could survive a condescending 37-year-old with a consultant's vocabulary and 0 operational knowledge. But something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a change in cabin pressure, subtle, then impossible to ignore. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 46 years old, and until that afternoon, I was the most reliable systems architect Meridian Financial had ever employed. Not the loudest, not the most visible at the executive retreats, but the man responsible for keeping $400 million in daily transaction volume running without a single critical failure. I'd built our legacy infrastructure from the ground up when the previous IT director quit mid-implementation and left us holding a half-finished migration that one wrong move could have collapsed entirely. I'd come to Meridian after my final Air Force tour ended the same week my marriage did. My daughter Simone was 11 years old, asking why Daddy wasn't going to be at the same address anymore. My mother, 2 hours away, in Charlotte, had just been diagnosed with the early stages of Parkinson's. I needed stability, good benefits, and a salary that could cover her care supplements and still put something away for Simone's future. Meridian offered all 3, and I gave them everything I had in return. In the Air Force, I'd been a communications systems specialist. You learn quickly that when a system fails at altitude, there's no calling someone else. You understand every component, every failover, every single point of failure, because the people depending on you have no alternatives. I brought that same philosophy to Meridian. I didn't just manage systems, I understood them the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Every patch cycle, every vendor negotiation, every 3 a.m. emergency, I handled it because I knew if I didn't, nobody else could. My director had attended exactly 2 technical briefings since joining the company. Both times, he'd spent most of the meeting checking messages under the table. He understood our infrastructure the way a passenger understands how a plane stays in the air, not at all, but confident it would keep happening regardless. The promotion was supposed to be mine. I'd been told as much by 3 different executives over the past 2 years. Senior Director of Systems Architecture, a $60,000 salary increase, the kind of title that would finally reflect what I'd been doing for a decade, and enough financial breathing room to move my mother into the assisted living facility her neurologist had been recommending for 2 years. Instead, he'd given the position to a woman he'd hired directly from his previous firm. She was sharp, I'll give her that. But she'd been at Meridian for 6 weeks and couldn't tell our payment processing system from our customer data platform. The morning after the meeting, I sat in my truck in the parking garage for 11 minutes. Not because I was emotional, because I was thinking clearly for the first time in years. I walked into the building at exactly 8 a.m., not 6:15, the way I'd been arriving for the past decade to get ahead of whatever fire was waiting. Not 7, which was my unofficial second start time for the mornings I was feeling generous. Exactly 8. The time printed on my employment contract, which I had reread the night before with the focused attention I used to give technical specifications. I went directly to my desk. I did not check the overnight monitoring alerts. I did not review the weekend incident log. I did not call the offshore support team to follow up on the 2 open tickets they'd escalated Friday afternoon. I opened my task management system, identified the 4 items in my queue that were explicitly within my job description, and began working through them in order. By 9:30, the first knock on my office door came. It was Derek from the payments team, a guy I'd mentored through 3 system migrations over the past 4 years. Good engineer, sharp instincts, the kind of person who would have been excellent in the Air Force. Hey, Marcus, the ACH batch processing is throwing timeout errors on the retry queue. Did you see the alert? I looked up from my documentation review. I did not, I said. I've been focused on the quarterly audit materials. He stared at me. The quarterly audit. Right. But the ACH thing, it's the same pattern as that issue in February. Remember? You fixed it in about 20 minutes last time. I remember, I said. The root cause was a thread pool exhaustion issue tied to the vendor's connection limit. It's documented in the incident report from February 14th. Ticket number INC 2847. Everything I did is in there, step by step. Derek's expression shifted from confused to something closer to concerned. So, you're not going to... I have the DoD compliance documentation due to the audit committee by end of week, I said. I'd start with the vendor portal and cross-reference section 4 of that incident report. It walks through the exact sequence. He nodded slowly and left. I watched him go and felt something I hadn't felt in years, a stillness. Not guilt, not satisfaction, just clarity. By noon, the timeout errors had spread to a secondary queue, and someone from operations had escalated to my director. He appeared at my door around 1:15, looking the way he always did when technical problems materialized, slightly irritated, completely lost, and searching for me to translate. Marcus, what's the status on the ACH situation? I looked up. I'm not the primary on that incident. Derek escalated through the correct channel this morning. Has the vendor been looped in? He blinked. I don't know. Can you just handle it? I have the audit documentation due Friday, I said pleasantly. I'd need to reschedule that to take on an additional active incident. Would you like me to push the audit? He didn't answer that. He couldn't, because we both knew the audit committee included 3 board members and missing that deadline had legal implications. He walked away without another word, his footsteps faster than usual. I left at 5 p.m. on the dot. My phone started vibrating around 6:30 while I was at my mother's apartment helping her with her physical therapy exercises. She'd had a good day, more mobility in her left hand than the previous week, and sharp enough to beat me at 2 rounds of rummy before dinner. I turned the phone face down on her kitchen counter and kept playing. She noticed. You're not checking that? Not right now. She studied me across the card table with the kind of quiet intelligence she'd always had, even sharper now that her world had slowed down. Something happened at work. Something changed, I said. That's different. She hummed and laid down a winning hand. About time. When I finally checked my phone in the car at 8:45, there were 19 missed calls and 11 voicemails. I listened to the first 3 Derek, increasingly urgent, my director, carefully controlled, and a name I hadn't expected, one of the senior VPs who oversaw enterprise operations. I set the phone on the passenger seat and drove home. Simone was at the kitchen table working on her college essays when I walked in just after 9. She was 17 now, honor roll, the kind of focused and self-possessed person her mother and I had always hoped she'd become despite everything. You're home, she said, like it was a question. I'm home. She pushed her laptop aside. Okay, what happened? I sat down across from her. I told her the short version, the promotion, the decision I'd made, the calls I wasn't returning. She listened the way she always listened, without interrupting. So you're doing exactly your job, she said when I finished. Nothing more, nothing less. That's right. She thought about that. She got that from me, the long pause before speaking, the need to turn something over completely before committing to a response. And the system problems? Those aren't your fault. They're the result of years of deferred knowledge transfer, I said. I've submitted requests for cross-training documentation 12 times in the past 3 years. All 12 were deprioritized due to budget or schedule. She nodded slowly. You documented that. Every single one. She picked up her pen and tapped it against her notebook. Dad, are you okay? I thought about it honestly. I'm the most okay I've been in 2 years. The next morning, I arrived at 8 again. The office had a different energy, the kind of stillness that follows a storm that hasn't quite hit yet. 3 people from operations were clustered near the system's monitoring wall when I passed, and my director's office light was on. It was 7:58 a.m. He was never in before 8:30. I settled at my desk and pulled up my task queue. The ACH issue had been escalated to a priority 1 overnight. 2 other processing queues were showing degraded performance. And, according to the email chain that had been CCing my address without requiring my action, our largest institutional client, Hargrove Capital, A firm whose transaction volume represented roughly 12% of our daily throughput had sent an inquiry to our relationship management team asking about the status of their wire processing. I read the chain carefully, marked it read, and opened the audit documentation file. Marcus. My director was at my door within 20 minutes, this time with the senior director he'd promoted 6 weeks ago. She looked exhausted in the particular way of someone who'd been solving problems in a code base they didn't understand at 2 a.m. "We need your help on the processing degradation," he said. "It's becoming a client issue." "I understand," I replied. "Who's the incident lead?" He and the new senior director exchanged a look that told me everything. "I've asked Sarah to lead it," he said carefully, "but she could use your technical input on the legacy architecture." I turned to Sarah directly, because none of this was her fault. She'd been handed a role she wasn't ready for, in a system she'd never seen before. That wasn't her choice. "The queue degradation is most likely related to a thread synchronization issue in the batch processor," I said. "The relevant architecture documentation is in Confluence, under Legacy Systems, subsection Payment Infrastructure. The file is called MW Arch 2019 Batch Processing V4. Everything is in there." She was scribbling notes. "Is there a more recent version?" "That is the most recent version," I said. I submitted a request to update it last spring and was told documentation wasn't a priority for the current quarter. My director's jaw tightened. "Can you walk us through it directly? Right now?" "I have 3 items due to the audit committee this week," I said. "I'm happy to reschedule if that's the preferred priority, but I'd need that in writing given the compliance implications." The silence that followed had a texture to it. He walked away. Sarah stayed another moment, her expression caught somewhere between professional composure and genuine distress. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know this situation isn't fair." I looked at her steadily. "You're doing the right thing by asking for documentation. That's exactly what should happen." She left. I returned to the audit. I left at 5. My phone rang 31 times before I silenced it. Voicemails from Derek, Sarah, my director, 2 operations managers, and one from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be the VP of Enterprise Operations calling from her personal cell. My mother called at 7 just to check in. We talked for 45 minutes about her garden, my childhood, a movie she'd watched twice that week. When she asked about work, I told her things were in the middle of shifting. "Shifting toward what?" she asked. "Toward what they should have been a long time ago." The next morning was different again. I could feel it from the moment I badged into the building. The energy was the kind that exists when people have been in crisis mode long enough to move from panic into something colder and more deliberate. The kind of energy that precedes decisions. My director appeared at my desk at 9:15. He did not look the way he normally did. He looked the way people look when something they assumed was structural has turned out to be personal, specifically when the person they underestimated has turned out to be the structure. "Emergency meeting," he said. "Conference room B." Now, when I walked in, the room was fuller than I expected. My director, Sarah, the VP of Enterprise Operations, whose name was Diane Holloway and who had joined Meridian 3 years before I had. And on the screen at the end of the table, a video call with a man whose face I recognized from a dozen client briefings over the past decade, the CFO of Hargrove Capital. "Marcus," Diane said, with a relief in her voice she didn't bother disguising. "Thank you for being here." The CFO leaned forward on screen. "Mr. Webb, we've had wire processing delays on 14 transactions over the past 48 hours. My team is telling me it's a systemic issue on Meridian's end. Your name keeps coming up as the person who understands this infrastructure." "It does," I said, taking my seat. "Can you describe the specific failure mode you're seeing?" He described it. I listened, and within 90 seconds I understood exactly what had happened. I always did. That was the part they'd been taking for granted. "It's a cascading timeout in the retry logic," I said. "The batch processor has a dependency on a connection pool that's been configured for normal load, not the elevated volume you had this week. When the retry queue backed up, it started pulling from the primary pool, which degraded the real-time wire processing. It's documented in the architecture review I submitted 14 months ago, flagged as a risk that needed a configuration update. The update was deferred." The CFO looked at my director. "You knew about this risk?" "It was on a list of technical optimizations," my director said carefully. I reached into the folder I'd brought with me and placed a single sheet of paper on the table, the risk documentation, dated, with the deferral approval signature. My director went very still. Diane leaned forward. "Can you fix it, Marcus?" It's a 4-hour remediation, I said. I can have it done by end of business. The CFO nodded once. Then let's do that. I'd like Marcus on this personally. I'll need written authorization to prioritize this over the audit documentation, I said. The committee presentation is Friday. Diane was already reaching for her laptop. Done. I'm sending it now. I resolved the issue in 3 hours and 40 minutes. I documented every step in real time. When I finished, I sent a comprehensive summary to the audit committee, Diane, and the operations team with a note explaining the root cause, the 14-month-old risk flag, and the remediation steps, all in plain language that didn't require a systems background to understand. An hour later, Diane Holloway knocked on my office door. "Close it," she said. I closed it. She sat down across from me and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. The Hargrove CFO called me directly after the fix. He said, and I'm quoting here, "Meridian needs to make sure Marcus Webb knows he's irreplaceable. I appreciate that." She folded her hands on my desk. "I'm going to ask you something directly, Marcus, and I need a direct answer. Have you been," she chose her word, "carefully adjusting your level of contribution recently?" "I've been fulfilling my contractual obligations precisely as written," I said. "I've focused on tasks within my defined role and utilized the documentation and escalation processes the company has in place." She studied me. "Because of the promotion." I said nothing. She exhaled. "How long have you been managing the Hargrove relationship?" 9 years. I developed the integration specs when they first migrated to us. Their head of treasury operations calls me directly when they have questions. He's called me 44 times in the past 3 years. None of those calls ever went through the official relationship management process because it was faster for him to call me and get the answer in 5 minutes. None of that is in your job description. "No," I said. "It never was." Diane was quiet for a long moment. "I want to have a different conversation than the one you had with your director 2 weeks ago," she said finally. "Would you be willing to come to my office tomorrow morning at 9? I said yes. That afternoon, my director appeared in my doorway for what felt like the first time in months where he wasn't asking me to fix something. He looked different than he had that morning, the professional control still there, but something underneath it that had softened, or maybe just deflated. "Can we talk?" he said. We talked. "I want to understand something," he said, once we were seated. "When I told you that you weren't the right fit for senior director, what specifically did you think I was missing?" He blinked. That wasn't quite what he'd expected. "I thought you were technically strong," he said slowly. "Exceptional, actually. But I thought senior leadership required a different kind of profile, more executive presence, stakeholder management, visibility." I asked him a question. "The Hargrove relationship, who built that?" "You did. But the relationship is with Meridian, not with you personally." "Is it?" I said. "Their CFO asked for me by name this morning." "Not Meridian, me." He didn't have an answer for that. "The Patterson contract," I stopped myself. "Wrong story." I looked at him steadily. "I've been managing stakeholder relationships for 9 years. I've been doing executive-level work for the entirety of my time here. I simply did it while standing behind other people." He was quiet for a moment. "If you stay," he said finally, "I want things to be different." "They will be," I said, "whether I stay or not." The meeting with Diane the next morning lasted 90 minutes. She had done her homework. On her desk was a printed summary of every risk flag I'd submitted in the past 5 years, every client relationship I'd managed informally, every system I'd built or rebuilt or saved. She'd pulled it herself, she told me, over the previous evening. "I'm creating a position," she said. "Director of Systems Architecture and Infrastructure, reporting directly to me. Base salary of $160,000, performance bonus tied to system reliability metrics, 2 days remote per week, and full authority over technical infrastructure decisions, no more deferring on risk flags without written executive approval." She pushed the offer letter across the desk. I picked it up. I read it. The number was real. The authority language was specific and binding. It was everything I'd been doing, without the title, the pay, or the protection. "There's an offer from another firm," I said. "I want to be honest with you about that. They've been pursuing me for 4 months. It's a good offer." She nodded. I assumed. "Can I ask, what's holding you back from accepting it?" 12 years of institutional knowledge," I said. "Relationships I've spent a decade building. My mother's doctor is here. My daughter's school is here. And," I looked at her, "and I want to know that what happened with the promotion wasn't just a single bad decision. I want to know the structure is changing, not just the title." She met my eyes. "I'm telling you it is. But I understand if you need to see it to believe it." I asked for a week to decide. She gave me 3 days. That evening, I drove to Charlotte to have dinner with my mother. We sat on her small patio in the October cool, and she asked me about work with the particular patience of someone who has learned that the most important things take time to say correctly. I told her everything. The promotion, the 2 weeks of working exactly to contract, the Hargrove crisis, the offer on Diane's desk. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she refilled both our glasses and looked out at the street for a moment before she spoke. "You know what your father used to say," she said. "He'd say the measure of a man isn't whether he gets the credit when things go right. It's whether he shows up when things go wrong." "You always showed up," I said. She smiled. "So did you. The question is whether you want to keep showing up for people who've finally figured out what that's worth." I thought about Simone at the kitchen table, working on her essays. I thought about the afternoon I'd spent watching my mother beat me at cards instead of staring at a monitoring dashboard. I thought about the 12 years I'd given to a company and the specific feeling of walking out at 5 with nothing left undone that was actually mine to do. I thought about the 14 engineers on my team who'd come to me over the past decade with questions that no one else could answer, and what it would mean if I left and took that knowledge with me, the way the person before me had left Meridian and taken his. 2 days later, I accepted the offer. With one condition. Diane raised her eyebrows across the desk. "I want a formal knowledge transfer program built into my role. Funded, scheduled, and evaluated quarterly. I've spent 12 years being a single point of failure. That needs to end regardless of whether I stay or go. The next person in this seat, whoever that is, whenever that is, should find an organization that can function without any one person." She studied me for a long moment. That's not what most people ask for when they're negotiating. "I know," I said. "It's what the organization needs." She reached for her pen. Done. The first month in the new role was the hardest, in the way that doing things correctly is always harder than doing them fast. I spent the first 2 weeks in documentation review sessions with every engineer on my team, not lecturing but asking, "What do you understand? What's unclear? Where are the gaps?" Most of them knew more than they'd been trusted to demonstrate. That's usually how it works. Derek turned out to have a natural grasp of the batch processing architecture that rivaled mine. He'd just never been given the authority or the expectation to lead anything. I changed that in his first week. Sarah, the woman my director had put in the senior director role, came to me 2 weeks in and asked if we could meet. She'd been carrying the weight of a decision that wasn't hers and managing systems she'd been thrown into without preparation. I'd watched her work in those first weeks and seen something I recognized: someone who was genuinely capable, operating in conditions designed to make her look otherwise. "I'm sorry about how this happened," she said when we sat down. "I know you are," I said. "And I want to be clear that none of my actions were directed at you. What I needed to change was a pattern, not a person." She nodded. "I'd like to learn the architecture, properly, from the ground up. That's exactly what I'd like to help you do." My director and I found our way to something functional, which is probably the honest word for it. He was better at the parts of the job I was worse at: client presentations, executive narratives, the kind of boardroom fluency that gets budget approved. I was better at the parts that kept the company from falling apart. Once we stopped competing for the same lane and operated in our own, things moved more smoothly than either of us expected. He stopped in my office one afternoon, 4 months in, while I was reviewing the quarterly reliability metrics. Our system uptime was at 99.97%, the highest in 3 years. He looked at the numbers on my screen for a moment. "I owe you an apology that I've been working up to," he said. I waited. "When I said you weren't the right fit for senior leadership, I was wrong. I was using a definition of leadership that was really just a definition of visibility, what you do, the depth of it, the way the whole operation depends on it. I didn't understand that when I came in. I thought I was evaluating you. I was actually demonstrating what I didn't know. I appreciated the honesty of it." "That means something," I said. "I hope it does. I also want you to know that I submitted your name to the Executive Committee's Leadership Recognition Program. Whatever they decide, I thought the record should reflect what you've actually contributed." He left. I sat with that for a few minutes, then went back to the metrics. 6 months after the new title, I drove up to Charlotte on a Friday afternoon and took my mother to the facility tour she'd been putting off. Her neurologist had been clear the progression was manageable, but would benefit from the additional support. She'd been resistant for 2 years, partly out of independence, partly because she knew I couldn't afford it. She walked through the common areas and the therapy rooms and the small private apartment they showed us, and she was quiet the whole time with that focused attention she'd always had. In the parking lot afterward, she stood next to my truck and looked at me. "You can actually afford this now," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. "Your father would be proud of you," she said, "not for the title, for how you got there." Simone was accepted to 3 engineering programs by March. She chose the one with the strongest systems design program, which she told me with the particular casualness of someone who has been quietly making decisions for years and is only now showing her hand. At dinner that weekend, she asked me what I'd learned from the whole thing. The way she asked it carefully genuinely reminded me that she was going to be someone's colleague someday, maybe someone's boss, and that what I said next might actually matter in ways I couldn't predict. "I learned that being essential and being recognized are different things," I said, "and that waiting for someone else to fix that gap is a way of participating in the problem." She thought about that. "Is that why you came home that first night instead of answering the calls?" "It was part of it," I said. "The other part was that I'd been confusing being needed at work with being present at home. Those are not the same thing. It took someone deciding I wasn't leadership material to remind me what I actually wanted my life to look like." She looked at me for a moment. "You know what's funny?" "What?" She smiled. "You did more to change that company's culture by doing less than you'd been doing than you ever could have by just staying." I thought about the knowledge transfer sessions, the documentation library Derek was now maintaining, the 3 engineers who'd been promoted in the past quarter because the structure finally existed to recognize them. I thought about the risk flag process that now required executive sign-off in writing before any deferral, a policy that existed because I'd put a single sheet of paper on a conference room table at the right moment. "Sometimes the system doesn't change until it costs someone something," I said. "And sometimes the only person positioned to make that happen is the one they never bothered to promote." She raised her glass. "To being underestimated," she said. I raised mine. "Only once," I said. "Only once,